Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to this Elevate Parent webinar. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes at 6 o'clock. So please take this time to grab whatever you need, glass of water, cup of tea, glass of wine. Also, if you want a pen and paper, if you're going to be taking any notes, as this session is on note making, it would be apt. Please feel free and I will come back at 6 o'clock and we'll start then. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Elevate Parent webinar of 2023. So happy to be back. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining another one of our parent webinars. And for those of you who are new, I know we've got lots and lots of new parents and families on the call tonight. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of what I'm sure for everybody is a very busy evening, start of term, start of the year. So thanks for joining us. I will give you a little bit of an overview about what we're doing, who I am, and what this session is going to be about. So this parent webinar tonight is about note making and independent study. And for those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Molly and I'm a head coach and a presenter with Elevate. So those two roles are slightly different. So my role as a head coach means that I sort of manage our consultants and our coaches meeting with families and students to then match students with an Elevate coach and then build a bespoke study skill coaching program, which the aim of that is always to sort of make a student's life easier in the classroom, easier at home when they're studying as well, and for them to realise their true potential. So that's my role as a head coach. And then as a presenter, that involves me delivering seminars across schools and colleges in the UK to parents and carers like yourself, to teachers, and most importantly to students as well. So tonight I'm going to be sort of bringing this experience that I have in those two different roles with Elevate to talk about what you guys as parents and carers and families can be doing to help your children make notes effectively, and then actually how to use them in independent study and revision. So in terms of the structure for this evening, it will be a very similar structure to the other webinars we've done. So what we're going to do is I will just start with a brief introduction to who we are at Elevate, because I know we've got lots of new people. I always do say apologies if you are a regular and you've heard it before. Please just feel free to switch off for a few minutes. Then I'm going to sort of do a couple of questions, a little questionnaire, and then I'm going to dive into the main sort of meat of the presentation for this evening, spend about 45-50 minutes sort of talking through this evening's content, and then what I'll do is actually leave sort of 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the session for a Q&A, and I'll actually answer questions directly from you guys. So if you have any questions, either sort of pre-prepared or any that just sort of pop up during the course of the webinar, you can actually submit those to Jess. Jess is head of coaching. She's going to be monitoring the chat this evening. And the way that you can access that chat is if you're viewing the webinar on our website, if you sort of clicked through the link that would have been sent to you in the email, if you just scroll down, there should be a little chat bubble on the bottom right-hand corner. You can type anything into that. That will go straight through to Jess. Or if you're actually watching us on YouTube, a little bit different. The chat bubble is actually on the website link. So what you can do is just scroll down into the description of the video, click on the link that takes you to our website, and then you can access the chat function there. Also, even if you just have any like small little questions that you want to pop in there during the webinar, that's absolutely fine. Jess will be there for any and all of your questions. And then the final thing that I just want to say, it's probably pretty obvious, but I know this is called a parent webinar, but I'm not a parent myself. I'm not here in any way to give you parenting advice. I wouldn't dream of it. It's absolutely not my remit. Instead, all my role is really here is to talk about the sort of study skills research that we've done, the study skills that we introduce students to, your children to, and then a little bit about the sort of neuroscience behind these skills, which comes from the 22 years of research that Elevate has undertaken. So that is me. Let's move on to a little bit more about Elevate and who we are, and then we'll move on to note making and independent study. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, who are we? Who is Elevate? So Elevate, we are the global leader in delivering study skills advice. And we've been around for 22 years now. And throughout that time, we've always been trying to better understand what it is that students do in order to get top results. So these quote unquote top students, which really just means the students who get those top results. We started off as a research company, so we've conducted a wealth of quantitative and qualitative research, and throughout that 22-year journey, it's really become perfectly clear, abundantly clear, that these top students, again with the air quotes, they don't get these top results because they are necessarily intellectually smarter than anyone else, or they're a sort of different subset of student. Not at all. It's far more about how they are studying. To put it simply, it's because they're working smarter than other students. And our research has shown that there are sort of 13 key skill areas across which the habits of these top performing students really do differ quite drastically from middle and lower performing students. And it's these 13 key skill areas and the habits that we've sort of taken from these students that form the basis of the programs that we run. So we're all about making students work smarter rather than harder. So these programs that we run in classrooms, in school, colleges as well, and then also privately through our coaching programs, that's sort of, what they're all about. That's the main aim. Also, I know I've mentioned it a few times about our one-to-one coaching. If you are interested in that, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end and how you can sort of get in touch with us and discuss more. So that is us. That's Elevate. So let's move on to our little questionnaire. Do not worry if anyone is sitting here thinking, oh my goodness, it's a quiz, what do I have to do? Don't worry at all. It's not a sort of, it's not a quiz, but instead just a chance for us to sort of find out a little bit about what your child currently does. So it's just a few brief questions, and it's absolutely not to test your study skills. It's all about your children. So those of you who've attended a previous webinar, you'll know the drill. But if it's your first time, if you can just use the chat box to enter in your answers to the questions as we go, that would be fantastic. So question number 1. On this question, could you actually, when you submit your answer, also add your child's year group? That would be super useful if you don't mind. So question number 1 is, when does your child start preparing for exams or tests? Is it A, 3 or more weeks before? Is it B, about 2 weeks before? Is it C, 1 week before? Is it D, 2 or 3 days before? Or is it E, the night before? Or possibly there's an F, and maybe that F is they don't prepare at all. You can add that in if you like. So roughly, when does your child start preparing for exams and tests? And like I said at the start, if you don't mind adding in your child's year group next to your answer, that would be fantastic. So, of course, timings here, drastically will depend on the year group that your child is in. But broadly, the sort of area that we're looking for is we suggest to students, around about 2+ weeks before their exam period starts. That's really crucial. So before their first exam for year 10s and below. And then for year 10s and above, we suggest sort of 3+ weeks before that exam period starts. And if you're sitting here thinking, oh, that doesn't sound like very much, absolutely, we would love it if students do more, but that's our sort of minimum zone that we're talking about. And the reason that we're sort of talking about that period of time is it allows for very specific exam preparation. So note-taking, memory, but then most importantly, practice papers and practice questions. So practicing that application, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So moving on to question number 2. Does your child make notes? A, yes. B, no. C, I don't know, which is absolutely valid. And by notes here, we're really meaning writing anything down. So that might be actually in lesson, doesn't have to just be at home as a form of revision. So does your child make some sort of notes in school, at home, or a combination of the two? Fab. Answers are flooding in. Lovely. So obviously what we are hoping for here, the clue's sort of in the title of the webinar, is we're hoping for A, we're hoping for yes. We do want students to make some form of notes. I'll talk a little bit more about exactly how, but yes, that's the starting point. We do want it. And whilst note-taking is not the most effective component of studying, it is still very, very important and without that solid set of notes, it's really hard for students to move on to these more effective components of study like memory and application and practice. So yeah, ideally all students year 7 right up to year 13, we want to get into that habit of making study notes throughout the term as they're moving through class content. Moving on to question number 3 then. We've actually had a lot of students and I would say parents as well talk to me about the sort of structure of their notes. It's something that a lot of students really care about. So I would love for you to answer this question. I'm very intrigued. So question number 3 is, do your child's notes have any of the following characteristics? A, are they messy? B, do they lack structure? C, do they have too much detail? D, do they have not enough detail? Or E, do they have no colour? So they're just written in black or blue. I'll actually add in an F here as well. Maybe an F is none of the above, if you have a child who has none of the above. So pretty obvious, what we're looking for here ideally is we're looking to actually have that F option. So none of the above that we've got written on the screen there. And what we're going to look at is some direct solutions to those problems and to those issues that we have listed. Great, so just 2 more questions. So question number 4, how does your child go about memorizing information? So if they were going to memorize some information for a test or an exam, what would they mainly do? A, reading notes and textbooks or revision guides. B, writing their notes, so rewriting or writing for the first time. C, quizzing themselves, might be flashcards or online, Seneca, different ways. D, are they doing practice questions or practice papers? Or E, I don't know. And again, actually with this one, if it's a combination, if they do lots of these different things, please do pop that in the chat too. Fab. So again, a little bit obvious like the other one. All of these things are good. Absolutely. We're not saying that that any of them are sort of something to remove. But what we often are finding with especially older students, so year 9 and above, I would say, is that D, practice papers, don't get enough focus. So that's something to almost put a big shiny star by and say practice questions, practice papers is a really, really key thing to do to practice memory and practice application too. Great, and final question, question number 5. This question is pretty much, I would say, for sort of older students, so year 9 and above, really. But if you do have a child in year 7 or year 8 who are thinking about practice questions, fantastic. So the question is, how many practice papers does your child do prior to an exam? A, 0, B, 1, C, 2, D, 3 or more, or E, I don't know. So how many practice papers? Fantastic. So, again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but what we want to be looking for students, GCSE and A-level or BTEC, so year 10 and above, is we ideally want students to look at doing 3+ practice papers per subject per exam. That might sound like a lot because you might be sort of tallying that up and thinking, goodness, well, if my child studies, 8 or 9 subjects at GCSE, whoa, that's loads. But actually, what we're saying there is it shouldn't be all condensed into one, short period of time, but it's something that we space out and we do a very deliberate process and a deliberate practice through those practice papers to make them slightly more chilled and easier at the beginning and move towards exam conditions. Again, do not worry, I will talk about this in a bit more detail near the end of the webinar. Fantastic. So hopefully this has got you sort of thinking about where your child is currently at and some of the skills that they are, working on, some skills that we can improve. And I know that we sort of briefly touched on it at the beginning, but really what we want to do, and the aim of all of our Elevate sessions, is about getting students to work smarter rather than harder. So that's something I'm going to break down now. So taking a little step back from sort of note making as the specific skill, what we're really looking at this evening is how best does a student learn? And even more importantly than that, not just a student, but how best do humans learn? So here is a pyramid of learning that we actually introduce students to in our school seminar, Study Sensei. And what it's about is it's about the 3 levels of acquiring knowledge. So these are the 3 stages that you go through to get from, I have absolutely no idea what's going on, to mastery, mastering that subject or skill. So the first stage is to learn. So every time that your child is in a classroom, or you yourself are in a classroom, or even tonight with this webinar, you are learning, I hope. And this is all about information. So the best sort of metaphor that we have for this learn stage of the pyramid, and one that we share with students, is that of a computer. So imagine that you're downloading a file from the internet. First step is to simply download. You don't yet know what this information is, you don't know how it's going to be useful for you because you haven't even opened the file, but you were just getting the information. You're clicking on it, click download. And often this is where students, if we bring the analogy back to sort of the real world, this is where they stop. So they might say, yeah, I listen in class. Their teachers might say, yeah, they're present, they listen. They've done their homework. Maybe they even, wrote some notes down. So they feel like they've got all that information. They feel like that's all they need to do. Study ends there. They've absorbed it. But actually, what we found with the more effective students and learners is that they take that a step up. They take that to that second level in the pyramid, which is master. And this is where they can actually take that information and use it. They can begin to manipulate it, to evaluate it, and most crucially, to apply it. So an example of a stage of sort of knowledge acquisition for secondary school students would be completing a practice question, quizzing themselves, helping their peers, teaching to learn, discussing their content. And this is a step up. And these students naturally will just have a deeper understanding of the content. But they will still only know how to apply it within the context of their course curriculum. So they might be able to discuss it, but they can only apply it within sort of a limited zone. So students who get this far generally do well in exams, but they're often not the students who get those top marks because they're not standing out from their peer. They're not necessarily seeing the relevance in what they're learning and how it pertains to the world around them. They're just seeing it as sort of, this is the information I've got from class and I put it down. So as we move up to the sort of third stage of the pyramid, to create, this is where the top performers sit. Now, it might be that for you, your child, you're thinking, actually, no, mastery is where we're aiming. That's absolutely fantastic. But if you do have a child who's sort of aiming for that that top level, create is a really important stage. And what creating is about using and applying the information that they've learned in as many different situations or contexts as possible. So it's about combining information, possibly even information from different subjects, and then applying it to real world situations, problems, case studies. So very much the sort of bread and butter of an A level, but if a student could be thinking about this at GCSE, that's fantastic. So a lot of you might be sitting on the call now thinking, well, you know what, my child just learns. They're just at that bottom stage of the pyramid right now. And the question sort of becomes, at each of these levels, what is the specific tool or skill that is going to take a student through, that level into the next? I like the way that I like to think about this is sort of as a gate. So how do we get through that learn gate? Then we're there. How do we get through that master gate? And then finally, how do we get through that create gate? And this is a nice segue, really, into the 3 essential skills that I want to go through this evening, which are going to take us, they're going to be the tool or the key to get us through those 3 gates. So to help a student learn more effectively, that sort of first rung, first gate, to help them download that information, the essential skill here is note making. So students engage, they see, they hear a lot of information, and they need to be able to filter out the white noise and get to the key points down on the paper in a format that allows them to better understand it when they read back over it or they go back to it to prepare. So to help students master the content, that second stage, to get them to use it more effectively, that's when they need to be able to memorize the information long term. So that's a skill to get us through the master gate is memorization. And then beyond this, the question really becomes, well, now that I know these things and I've memorized them, how do I then combine them and apply the things that I've learnt? And the skill that's going to get us to that create level is deliberate practice, which means sort of taking the information that we've memorized, using it, applying it to real world problems and to create real world solutions. So those are the 3 skills that I'm going to walk us through. Note making, a bit about memory, and then a bit about deliberate practice as well. So we'll start with that first skill, which is note making. So for many of you on the call tonight, this style of notes that you can see on the screen, they might look a little bit familiar. Let's say pretty messy, a little bit all over the place, scribbles, doodles, a little bit chaotic. You probably don't need me to tell you that this is not the best way to take notes. Or perhaps if your children's notes don't look like that, they may look a little bit like this. Beautiful, perfect handwriting, headings, subheadings, structure, a lot of time sunk into these notes. I've met countless students who do make notes like this that we've got on the right. But actually, these notes, believe it or not, although they do look beautiful and almost typed, they're still not effective. They look good, they're aesthetically pleasing, but that's actually a bit of aesthetic bias there. If something looks good, it probably is. That's what we often think, but that's not the truth here. And the reason, we'll break it down a bit more, is that there's just far too much information on the page there. So when it comes to note taking, we find that students tend to fall into sort of one of 3 categories. Firstly, number 1, the perfectionist. So that might be the person who's written the notes on the right there. So they take detailed notes over and over again, sometimes as many as 3 or 4 times until they're perfect. They write them in class, they rewrite them for revision. It's all about the aesthetics. Number 2 is the messy note taker. So notes are scribbled down quickly just so that they can get on with the next task in hand. There's no structure. And then 3, the third sort of category, is the non-starter. So these are students who just don't take notes at all. They rely on their textbooks or on teacher handouts to embed the information later. So I'd absolutely love if you guys can pop it into the chat right now. Where does your child fit in those 3? So number 1 was the perfectionist, number 2, the messy one, and number 3, the non-starter. So if you could pop 1, 2, or 3, that would be fantastic. I would love to just do a little straw poll. So all 3 present their own problems, but what is really clear is that students don't know necessarily from the get-go how to make notes. It might feel like quite an instinctual process, but actually it's something that I would say the vast majority of students that we meet can do with some help and some structure. So in determining the sort of most effective and efficient way to take notes, what we need to do is sort of step back and ask, well, why are we making notes in the first place? What is the point? And that's often what students will ask me, and it's a fair question. So, when you flip it back and ask students, often, if you say, well, why do you think we take notes? Most of them will say for memory. It's to memorize information. They'll say if they make notes, if they write something down and they rewrite it, they're likely to be able to keep that in their memory. But in actuality, taking notes is not just about memorizing the content. It's crucially about understanding the content. So let me show you sort of what I mean here in a simple way. So here is what your child is probably doing at the moment, this sort of process we've got here. So they listen in class, hopefully, or they read their textbook or their handout or resource online. They write it into their notes, often word for word. 3, the sort of third stage, is they check that they wrote it down correctly, they check the grammar, the syntax, the information, and then number 4, they move on. But the problem with this is that when students are focusing on just taking notes, and that is a sort of crucial difference between two terms there, taking and making. When they're just focusing on taking notes and focusing on them being correct and the wording, the grammar, the spelling, they have all the information down, they're making little attempt to actually understand and grapple with the content. So what should we want them to do instead? Because, that first process, it's great that they're trying, but how can we improve it? Well, what we would prefer and what we sort of coach and we talk about in our seminars as well is firstly, absolutely, listening is important. Listen to the teacher, read the resource, the PowerPoint, the textbook. Secondly, then, think and process the information that they're taking in before they try to write it down. Then number 3, write some notes, but write that information down in their own words to consolidate their understanding. Now that's something to have a little asterisk by, because some teachers say, please copy this down word for word. Of course, if their teacher is saying that, that is what they should do. Always follow your teachers. But often, a teacher might be saying, write this point down. That's where we should bring in our own vocabulary, our own sort of phrasing, so that it's going to make more sense to us when we come back to read it. 4, the 4th stage there that we've got, is checking that they truly understand what they've written. Do they understand what they've just written down? If not, flag that immediately. Say to a teacher, I'm not sure I understand that. Flag that in the lesson. And then 5, if they follow these steps, they're much more likely to remember it when they come back to this information. So how do we sort of move students into this second model? What we're really asking students to do here is to spend a little bit more time thinking and processing and actually less time writing. So we need to show them how to make their notes more efficiently, that writing stage. We need to show them how to format their notes, and we need to show them that if they don't write down every single word, that is okay. They're still going to have the information. So how do we actually do that practically? Tip number 1, we start making notes, not taking them. As I said before, it looks like a very, very small difference. It's just changing one letter, but it's really key. So a lot of students note take. Teacher writes on the board, shares a PowerPoint, speaks to the class, student reads a resource, they write down exactly all of the information into their notebook or into their onto their word processor, and they think, great, fantastic, I've taken some notes. However, as soon as students start making notes on their own, using their own words, they're much more likely to understand what they are learning because they've already engaged with it. They've produced something that gels well with their learning style. So I want you to sort of think now about how your child makes notes in class or takes notes and compare it to sort of what I'm about to show you. So the first thing that we encourage all students to do is to use trigger words. So that is number 1, using trigger words. I'll come to this sort of diagram here in a moment. So if you find that your child is writing lots and lots and lots of information with lots and lots of detail, a bit like those notes that I showed you from The Perfectionist, the question really becomes, is every single thing on that page important? Usually the answer is no. And in fact, most students from our research, the majority of students can reduce the number of words on a page in their notes by about 80%. So reduce by 80, just retain 20%, and still fully understand the content and what they're saying. So we can get rid of about 80% of those notes. A really good sort of example of trigger words in action is a reminder note. So if you guys are anything like me, I'm constantly writing reminder notes on my fridge, on my phone, lists, things like that. So say you were writing a little reminder note to pick up some milk. You're not going to write down, must go to the co-op and pick up a 2 pint of semi-skim milk, take it to the checkout, pay for it, and bring it home so that I can have a coffee later. Too much info. You're just going to write milk. Milk, the single word, tells you all that other information. You don't need the rest of it. And that's because that one word triggers you to remember the rest of the information. And what we call that sort of process is the divergent property of the human brain. So you start with one word and you diverge into a number of separate ideas. So another example might be if I said to you guys, The Simpsons, what are you instantly thinking of? You might be thinking of Homer, Bart, Marge, Lisa, the characters. Then maybe you're thinking, cartoons. Family Guy, that's sort of similar. Oh, other animations, comedy shows. Suddenly, just from that one phrase, The Simpsons, you've diverged into lots and lots of different ideas that are linked to it. So you can see how it sort of works, the basis of it. One word can cascade into a number of ideas, and that's what we want students to do with their notes. So the question that people often ask, and students as well, is say, okay, well that makes sense, but how do you actually get a student or get myself to write in trigger words? How do we write less? And the answer is that really a student needs to be able to ask themselves at the very beginning when they're in class or engaging with info, why am I listening? Or why am I reading this piece of text? Why is it important? Why is it relevant? The big thing is the why. And then from that, then they need to be able to pull out the key points that are linked to that. This process that I'm explaining really about the sort of the why and then pulling out information is actually the process that we sort of coach and teach is dynamic reading. Unfortunately, I don't have time this evening to sort of go into the real nitty gritty of dynamic reading, but it is something that we talk to students about in school and in coaching. And if you guys would like to sort of research it, and if you think that's an area of where you're thinking, yeah, that's the area my child struggles in, the sort of the why do we make notes, I would say jot down dynamic reading, give it a quick Google after this because it's really, really interesting. So once we've got the why, what's the point, let's focus on the notes. The next things that becomes really important in helping students to write less is providing them with a structure. And the structure that we recommend to Elevate is the Cornell note structure. So that's Cornell, like the university in America. That's where it was developed. And you can see a sort of quite a basic example of Cornell notes here. That's what we've got here on the right. So if we were going to be making Cornell notes, the very, very first thing is simple, is to draw a dotted line down the page. We usually say sort of maybe 1/3 and then 2/3, so that might be slightly off on the proportions there. Then we have a heading at the top of the page, and then we have our subheadings here down the left, and then the right side becomes sort of the area for our main notes, which is where we have trigger word bullet points, diagrams, imagery, all of the sort of key information, and we have our subheadings down the side there. There is a slightly different way of doing it as well, Cornell Notes, where you could have this left-hand side here more for sort of keywords. That's something that I would say is great for maybe older students. That can almost become a sort of jotter zone where you put down keywords, key terminology. But yeah, we're always going for this split page method. That's the common factor. And also it's great to do that and split the page 1/3 and 2/3 because instantly you have a good litmus test for whether your notes are too detailed. Because if you're writing a bullet point that's going over one line and running into the next line, it's too long. Give yourself that sort of strict framework at the beginning and say my bullet points have to just be single. Then you're probably in the right zone. And then finally at the very bottom, the fourth sort of element is this zone here for questions or a summary. So that might be questions for your future self. That might be, if I've just thought of a question that would be really useful to research, I might jot it down there. Or, I didn't quite understand that. I need to write myself a question so I can reflect back. Or if it's a summary, summarize that class or summarize that information that you were making the notes on. So this is Cornell Notes. And again, if you would like to know a little bit more about it, do have a Google because there's lots and lots of information out there. And it's spelled Cornell. So the aim, you can sort of see here, is encouraging students to write less, spend less time writing out excessively comprehensive notes, and reduce the number of words on the page. The second thing that I want to talk about here is colour. Keeping notes structured, we sort of covered that already. And number 3 is using a colour coding system. So often, actually, I would say in every single diagnostic session that we do, and in a lot of the school seminars I do, I talk to students about whether they use colour in their notes. And I would say 70, maybe 80% of them will respond by saying, is blue biro a colour? It is, but it's not actually colour coding, is what I say. Or I might get other students, usually there's sort of about 10 or 15% of these who absolutely throw their hands in the air and they're like, I love colour, Molly. I absolutely, I use 5 different colours for, every single sentence that I use, and look at my pencil case, I have 20,000 different highlighters. And at that point, I say, okay, so actually we've got 2 camps here. We've got the blue and black ink camps, and we've got the million highlighter camps. And actually, both of them could do with changing their system a little bit and meeting in the middle. Because what we're not really encouraging is that we're using, constant colour for no reason. That can actually be worse than not using colour at all. The reason for this is that colour helps us associate things in our brain to make them connected. So if we are using colour completely randomly, then actually that information on the page becomes very confusing for our brain to process. So what we want to do instead, we do want to use colour, but we want to use it in quite a structured way. We want to develop a specific colour coding system. So the most sort of simple system would be something that we've got running along the bottom here. So we might say with our Cornell notes, our keywords are always going to be in yellow, our headings are going to be in blue, and our subheadings are going to be in red. Nice and simple. Or we might take it a little bit step further and say, okay, well, for history, all of my dates are going to be in pink, all of my quotes are going to be in orange, and all of my key information is going to be in green. That would be sort of a stage up. Another thing to think about if you've got an older child is, can they try and sync up their colour codes across subjects? Because it can get a bit confusing if pink means quotes in history, but in English, quotes are in red. That can get a bit confusing. So we often talk about syncing up our colour codes across subjects. But really, the most important thing here, however your child wants to do it, is creating a system which separates and categorises types of information and is crucially developed by the student themselves, so it works for them and it's going to aid their memory. Great. So when we put all of this sort of advice into practice, the 3 things that we have here, using trigger words, keeping notes structured, and using a colour coding system, we end up with hopefully something like this on the right hand side, a really, really fantastic set of Cornell style notes. So that's what we're aiming for. If there's 3 sort of things to take away for notes, it would be these 3 that you've got on the screen here. The actual information is downloaded. So now we want to move on to that second bit of the pyramid, which is memorization. And that's the sort of the key, the skill that will get us through into that mastery gate. So for other students, for I would say most students, memorization usually takes the form of rote learning. Rote learning is repetition based, so they might rewrite their notes over and over again from their class notes. They might reread their notes over and over again. And whilst there is some benefit to this, repetition does give an element of aiding our memory. It's incredibly inefficient. It takes a really, really long time, and there are much better approaches to take, which are more efficient and free up more time for that high leverage revision and study that we're going to talk about it second. So firstly, I'm going to sort of talk through some slightly more efficient styles of memory, and then I'll get onto that sort of high leverage revision and study. What that is deliberate practice. So, a quote which I will be honest and hold my hands up, I have used a few times on these webinars, but it is a really good quote, which is from Albert Einstein. And the quote is, "You do not really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother." Now that is a little bit mean on grandmothers. We might even have some grandmothers on the call. You might be thinking, excuse me, I'm incredibly intelligent. So the way that I like to tweak it when I'm talking to students is I say, you don't understand something unless you can explain it to an alien, to someone who has absolutely no prior knowledge of this information. So this is a really, really key skill, a skill that we come back to quite a few times, is when we have incredibly complex information, we need to be able to express it simply. Because if we can say it simply, if we can explain it to someone who doesn't have a prior knowledge, it shows that we really understand it. And also it aids our memory in the process. So this process of sort of, speaking to people who don't necessarily know about the info, we call it teach to learn. So in order to learn, you must teach. So for students, a really good way of sort of checking their understanding and aiding their memory as well is to get them to practice explaining that information to someone else. A student actually that we worked with in our coaching program, it wasn't really something that he felt comfortable with sort of chatting with his friends. He was a little bit more introverted and it just wasn't something that would fit with him. So instead, he decided that he was actually going to do teach to learn with his dog. That might sound mad, but what he would actually do is when he would reach the end of his to-do list every night with his revision, he would go and get his dog, he'd sit down on the bed with his dog, and he would tell his dog about all of the things that he'd just learned and explain all the processes in a simple way. Now that might sound a little bit crazy, but actually it still works. We don't actually need to be teaching somebody who is going to necessarily reply to us or who is even necessarily going to learn from us. But it's actually that process of processing the information and then verbally explaining it. That's the really, really key thing here. So the core message really that I sort of want to convey by this is it's one of the best ways of memorizing information, and also it's active. It's not just rote learning, and it's really good for complex information too. So this is how to do it. How can we practically implement this skill? So step one, we do need to have some notes. If we haven't done the first stage before, it's going to be tricky. So get some notes. Then step two is explain the concept to somebody else. So, dogs are fine, but ideally a human is even better, I would say. So this could be something where actually you guys as parents and carers come in. Could you get your child to sort of explain their notes to you in 5 minutes after their revision session? A lot of parents have actually said to me that, often for GCSE and definitely at A-level, they say, oh my goodness, it was a long time ago since I did these subjects. I don't even know what my child is learning about at the moment in GCSE biology. It's it seems really advanced. Perfect. This is a perfect time for them to teach you or to refresh your memory. They can speak to you about the points that they've been writing, and also you gain a little bit of knowledge too. However, if you're thinking, that's not going to work for us in our family, I don't think my child would like to do that, maybe that they could explain it to a sibling or a friend, absolutely having a sort of, a study buddy and setting aside a study session where maybe they revise separately, but then they, hop on a Zoom call and have a discussion for 5 or 10 minutes to teach to learn. That would be a great thing to do as well. Then step number 3 is get asked questions. So again, if you guys could come in here by sort of quizzing them on their notes. So if they've got their notes that they've made, you take them off them and you give them some sort of quizzing or questions on them. Then step number 4, this is the really key bit, which I'd say is often a step which is maybe missed. That is about grading themselves on the information, on their memory, using a traffic light system. So the basic way of using this is sort of saying anything in their notes, any topic point or specification point that they are able to explain clearly, they get a green mark next to it. Fantastic, they know it. Anything that they sort of know but they can't quite explain that clearly, put a little orange mark next to that. And then anything that they don't remember at all, they're just like, whoop, don't know, not even sure that I've ever engaged with that, or they're struggling to remember it, pop a red mark next to that. Now you could be popping these green, orange and red marks actually in their notes, or if you had a specification, if your child is year 10 or above, fantastic, print out the specification and maybe pop the traffic light system on that instead. And then, what's the point of this? Why are they doing these colours? The reason is that then when they come back to the information, what they should start with is the red, because that's the sort of danger area. Then they should revise the red information, then move on to the orange, and then finally move on to the green. And that sort of avoids topic bias, or, treading over the information that they're familiar with. We want to actually, illuminate that red information that is, problem areas for them. And then the process becomes really simple. All it's about is taking red info to become amber info, then amber info to become green. And eventually our goal is that all of our notes or all of our specification has green marks or green ticks next to it. We know it, we've memorized it. Fantastic. And then finally, repeat the process. So this is something that wouldn't just be to do once for revision, but it would be something to do throughout the year. So as we're learning content, we're memorizing, we're testing, we're quizzing, we're grading. Fantastic. So repeat that process. Great. And then finally, the final point that I sort of want to talk about, we've covered the learn, bottom sort of section of the pyramid. We've covered the create in the middle, the master in the middle. And then we're moving up to the top of the pyramid, which was, I've sort of spoilt it now, but it was labeled create. So how are we actually going to get through that create gate? What is our key? What is our skill? It's about deliberate practice. So why is this photo on your screen right now? Why is Michael Jordan here? You might be thinking, what are we going to talk about? So the reason that I've popped this photo up of Michael Jordan is that he has a really, really good quote about deliberate practice. So he said, if you shoot 1,000 shots with bad technique, you become really good at shooting bad. But if you shoot 1,000 shots with great technique, then you become really good at shooting good. And that is, again, a quote that I have shared a few times, but it's so, so important. And always stress this to students, that it's not just about putting in the hours and doing it again and again and again, rote learning style, but it's about that technique. If we're practicing with bad technique, it's not going to be useful. If we're practicing with good technique, fantastic, we're going to be flying. So that's the key message, really. Practice is important, but perfect practice is more important. So how are we actually going to develop this sort of perfect or strong style of practicing? Deliberate practice. It's all about the process. So how do you sort of apply this idea of practice perfectly or deliberate practice with your child? So really what we're talking about here is the idea of applying knowledge. So doing practice questions and practice papers. But more crucially than that, it's about approaching them in a certain way. Now, I will put a little caveat here, because you might be thinking, Molly, my child is in year 7 or year 8 or year 9. Practice papers is not a phrase that I've really heard about. So let me just sort of define what it is, and then also talk about sort of younger students as well. So a practice paper would be a practice version of a formal exam that a student is going to sit. So it might be that they do a past paper. What that means is that, if they were doing AQA English literature, they might do a past paper from 2017 or 2018. They'd find that online, they'd do that paper, they'd mark it up, and that would be a sort of practice. Or sometimes schools develop their own practice papers that they sort of make themselves. And then a practice question would just be doing one question from that paper. However, that's really for GCSE and A-level and BTEC. So if you've got a younger child, year 7, year 8, year 9, they can absolutely still do practice questions, but that might come from being given from their teachers. It might be the questions at the end of their textbooks, at the end of every topic, or questions in a revision study guide. Those are still practice questions, but they're just maybe not a whole practice paper. I hope that's clear. So either way, whether we're doing a practice question or a practice paper, this is what we want to sort of think about. So spending at least 1 week on practice. So that is for year 10 and above. We want to be spending at least 1 week purely on practice. If you have a younger child, think of it instead as they want to spend roughly a third of their revision time on practice. So a third or a week. So this last week or this last third, before a test or an exam, should only be spent on practice. The notes are done, the memorizing's done, we're just practicing. And this is really important because it means that hopefully we're moving students away from that idea of last minute cramming. we're not going to be sort of frantically reading through a textbook the night before. We're not even going to be doing that 4 days before, because that last week is only going to be for practice. All of the note taking and the sort of core revision is already done. So when we've ideally got that 1 week, hopefully, or a third of the revision time, then what we want to focus on is how to actually approach a practice question or paper. And the way that we want to start is open book and open time. So this actually sort of touches on an area that we've spoken about in a few other webinars, which is the fear of failure. I mean, the fear of failure is universal, I would say, but it's absolutely something that sort of flags up a lot when we're talking to students about the pressure around exams. So what we want to try and do is remove that fear of failure. So we don't want students to, do their revision and then suddenly do a full practice paper or jump straight into a practice question and do it under exam conditions straight away, with their timer, no notes, and then maybe they do the whole paper. They haven't got that many right and they feel a little bit negative and they think, oh my goodness, that was really, really hard. Instead, we want to lower those barriers to entry. So when we're saying open book, what that means is that students should be able to have their notes with them. They could have their notes next to them while they're answering the question. They can have their textbook. They can have, whatever sort of information they need. That's okay. We're not testing their memory at that point. And then with open time, pretty obvious, they have as much time as they want. They can take breaks. They don't have to do it under, timed conditions. And what this does is this removes that initial fear of failure. It helps them to actually learn how to apply their knowledge, which is reinforcing their memory anyway. So it's actually really doubly useful. And it means that they're hopefully going to come away from that first practice question or paper feeling encouraged, feeling positive and thinking, actually, you know what? Few that I couldn't do, but there were a few that I could even without the notes. So for you guys as parents and carers, I'd really, really encourage students to try this approach of open book, open time first. Then moving on to the third stage, then we want to actually have closed book, open time. So again, really, really key stepping stone here. So we're making it a little bit harder. So it's a bit like riding a bike. We've sort of taken the training wheels off, but we're still going to have, somebody nearby to catch us if we fall. So we're not going to have our notes with us. We're not going to have sort of information, but we're still going to have open time and not put that time pressure on it. Also, I often say to students, especially year 11s at the moment, if you're going to do a practice paper, don't feel like you have to do it in one evening. Space it out across a week and say, you know what, I'm going to do just a little bit Monday to Friday evening, or Monday to Thursday maybe, have Friday evening off, and I'm going to space it out across a few days. That's absolutely fine at this stage. Then, number 4, we do at some point want to get to practicing under exam conditions. So we've sort of, we've stepped up the rungs of that ladder and we do want to be on that top rung of exam conditions. So what does that actually mean? Depends on the exam, but that would be having, the exact time of that exam. If you have any, resources you're allowed, then great. If not, put them away. Working in a space that's quite quiet, that sort of simulates that exam environment. And why is that important? The importance there really is that if you've practiced under those exam conditions, it gets you used to that environment so that on the day, those conditions aren't going to throw you. You're not going to be like, oh my goodness, I haven't actually done one with a big clock. How's that going to go? Great, we'll practice at home with a big clock. Some people even take it one stage further. I've worked with a family where their mum actually, was walking around the room like an invigilator. For them, that worked. For for the student I worked with, he was like, that was really great because it didn't throw me on the day. It's up to you, how far along those exam conditions you want to go. But the key things would definitely be the time, the resources, and somewhere quiet as well. So you become familiar. This is really key as well if your child listens to music quite a lot when they study. That's something to absolutely remove from deliberate practice. Because if we are starting to practice listening to music, it's not going to help us because on the actual day we cannot listen to music. It won't be allowed. So it's great to just start that practice without that distraction. So becomes familiar. That familiarity reduces our stress. And then finally, number 5, we want to reflect and rectify mistakes. That might sound like sort of quite obvious, but I promise you the amount of students that I've worked with where they've done a practice question or done a practice paper and then they haven't marked it or they haven't got it marked. If we don't get it marked and we don't get that feedback, it's sort of pointless. We've sort of thrown that time away. So what we want to do is, we always say the best people to mark practice questions and papers are teachers, of course, but the second best would be somebody else that's not them using the mark scheme. So the mark scheme would be going alongside a past paper. If you have a younger student who's doing questions from a textbook, likely the answers will be at the back of the book. So that would be something where, ideally you would mark your children's test from the answers at the back. We always say that the worst person to mark our own work is ourselves, and that's because we might be a little bit soft on ourselves. We might be like, oh yeah, that's sort of roughly what I meant, half mark here, half mark there, and it might not actually be an accurate reflection of how well we've actually done. So best people to mark is teachers, second best is a peer, a friend, a parent, third best is ourselves. And then that's the reflecting. That's the marking. Then the reflecting is actually working out, where did I go wrong? So not just, I got that question wrong. Why? How did I get it wrong? Was it my content knowledge? Was it my structuring? Was it my evidence? Was it my analysis? Is it a longer question and I should have expanded on it? Is it simply I just completely forgot that formula? Actually sitting there and giving that reflection time allows us to then move on to that second thing, which is rectifying the mistakes. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in our sort of exam preparation webinars, but yeah, we have some processes to sort of work on stage 5 there. So, final thing to just sort of say before we move on to the wrapping up, is that using practice questions and practice papers is a great way to consolidate your learning. So even if your child is not having an exam anytime soon, maybe is not even going to sit formal exams this year, actually this process is still super useful. And I think students sometimes don't quite see that link, that doing a practice question is not just for revision, it's actually for consolidating information, improving our memory. So it's something to do throughout the year, even when we're not in that sort of exam zone. And finally, that little pink quote at the bottom, that's just a really, really important thing to sort of take heed of, which is that in all of our research, the number one sort of differentiator between high-performing middle and low students was the number of practice questions and practice exams that they'd done and the way that they'd done it. So really, if you want to take away sort of a key thing, if you've got a student who's pretty good with learning, pretty good with memory, it's deliberate practice. It's doing these practice questions and practice papers. Fantastic. So, in summary, we've moved through those 3 levels. So, effective and smart study involves moving yourself up this pyramid. So, learn the content by taking in as much information as you can, making a set of concise notes in that Cornell style. Then secondly, master that content by testing others, teaching to learn, to consolidate your understanding, and by systematically reviewing it over time, so repeating that process. And then finally, the third thing is to begin to create your own links between what you're learning, where you will be asked what you're sort of being tested on around you. So we're pulling information from different subjects and we're applying it to the real world. And how do we do that? We do that through practice questions, practice papers, and we want to follow that deliberate practice process. So that is learn, create, and master. So, our 3 key takeaways. The first thing to remember, sort of moving up the pyramid, are notes are much more than just a word-for-word record of what your teacher is telling you. Write them in your own words to improve your understanding. Keep them short and sweet using that Cornell structure so that you can easily pull out the info later. So we say making revision quality notes the first time round. Second takeaway is rote learning is inefficient. So rewriting our notes, rereading our notes constantly is inefficient. So instead, we want to continually review our notes systematically throughout the year. But when exams are coming up, start testing yourself. Start trying to teach others to learn. And If you're thinking, actually memory is the area that's really, really tricky for my child, we're going to do a whole parent webinar next month in February just on memory. So there'll be a little bit about teach to learn, but there'll be some other skills there as well. And then finally, our third takeaway is deliberate practice makes perfect. So if we're year 10 and above, we want to leave an entire week before the start of our exam period just for practice. And if we are a younger student and we're doing a little bit less, we want to think of it as roughly a third of our revision time before an exam to solely focus on practice questions. But when we're doing these practice questions and papers, we want to follow that process that we talked about of starting a bit chilled, open book, open time, lower the sort of the barrier to entry, then take away the notes but still have as much time as you want, and then finally move on to exam conditions. Make sure you get everything marked and make sure you reflect and correct any mistakes that you make. So that is everything. So we will move on to a little bit of information about our coaching and then to the Q&A. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to have a sip of water. Lovely. So for those of you who haven't attended a webinar before and have heard me mention a few times about our coaching, I'll just give you a little bit of information about what we do. So we offer one-to-one bespoke study skill coaching, and that covers many of the skills that we talked about today, so note-taking, deliberate practice, how to structure revision, but also other skills including sort of more advanced memory techniques, motivation, time management and organisation, managing stress, all of those sort of areas. And if you would like to discuss it further, the way that you can talk to us is to book a 15-minute parent call, which would just be us speaking with you guys as parents and carers. And you can book that if you actually scroll down on the page that you're viewing the webinar now. There should be a calendar embedded, and there you can just click on a day, click on a time, and you can book a call with either myself, with Jess, who's head of coaching, or with Olivia as well, and we'll sort of just discuss how your child's getting on at the moment, and then we can set up their free diagnostic session, which is sort of a Zoom call where we'll find out a little bit more about how they study, and then we can talk about sort of building them a program. So that is Elevate Study Skill Coaching if you're interested. And moving on then finally to our Q&A. Jess will have sent through a few questions to me, so bear with me a moment while I just pull them up. Fantastic. So quite a few questions here. Lovely. So a question that we got through is, are you suggesting that every evening students rewrite their notes from the day into your suggested structure, or should they be able to do this in class as they take the initial notes? That's a fantastic question. So what I would say is to start off with Cornell notes, I would say try by when they get home converting their notes, but the aim of it actually is that they can use that Cornell structure in lessons, in sessions themselves, so that they are writing Cornell style notes from the get-go and then not having to rewrite them. But what we sort of do in coaching is we look at a sort of stepping stone approach where we'd introduce Cornell, we'd ask them to maybe try making a set of notes of them at home, then we would ask it to try it in class, and then we'd sort of develop and hone that skill. But yeah, absolutely, the aim is that students are making Cornell style notes in their actual lessons in class. Fab. This question says, my child has dyslexia and can't write down his notes. Do you recommend any others? Maybe any other ways? Absolutely, yeah. So apologies if I didn't make this that clear in the webinar. Absolutely, all of the processes and sort of key ideas that I've discussed today, they don't have to be about handwritten notes. Absolutely, digital notes are fantastic, and we can still apply all of those skills. Digital notes is something that personally I made all of my notes for my degree digitally, and I still used Cornell notes. That was the way that I made them, but making them digital. So if your son, I'm obviously not sure of your individual circumstances, but if your son is allowed to have a laptop or an iPad or word processor in class, still get him to be thinking about condensing, using his own words and using the Cornell, even if they're digital notes. Lovely. Another question is, at what age should my child start doing this process? She is just finishing year 7. Great question. So I would say with the note making, start now. Absolutely. Cornell is something that we introduced to year 7s. In terms of the memory, teach to learn. Absolutely, again, I think that's really, really key, and would be really fun for a year 7 to do. And in terms of the deliberate practice, that's where it might be a little bit different, in the sense of probably your child in year 7 isn't doing practice questions and practice papers, but she can still test herself and practice using the information by doing the questions from the end of her textbooks, or questions that the teacher gives her, or from study guides as well. Great. Oh, and then one final thing, actually, I just wanted to add to the question from the parent who said that their son is dyslexic. Another way of making notes, and we talk about this almost being the sort of transformation of notes, is using mind maps. So it doesn't just have to be Cornell. Mind maps are also a fantastic way for more visual learners to make their notes. I would say the key elements still apply, that it's putting it in your own words, it's using trigger words, and it's using color coding, but it's just maybe not putting it in that form of bullet points in the page, but instead using a mind map form as well. I would say many schools we work with really encourage mind maps as a way of making notes. Fantastic. So those are all of our questions this evening. So really it just remains for me to say our next webinar is Tuesday the 7th of February, and that's going to be about memory. So if there was anything that I was sort of talking about today about memory and you were thinking, oh, I'd like to know more, please do attend our webinar on that. The second thing is, if you do have a moment to leave some feedback, I'd really greatly appreciate that. If you just scroll down on the page, there should be a little feedback form. So if you've got any sort of comments or suggestions or thoughts about tonight's webinar, I would love to hear that. And then, finally, just thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar, and really hope to see you on our future webinars throughout 2023. Have a great evening. Take care.